Tonight's dinner. My name is Amy Friedlander, and I'm here on behalf of our sponsor, Arts+Labs, for tonight's dinner and panel. So some of you may be wondering, what is this Arts+Labs? Arts+Labs is a coalition between content creators, media companies, and technology companies to deal with issues as the digital economy changes in both policy and in commerce. So from the policy side, Arts+Labs works with policymakers, with other constituents, to try to come to some reasonable positions around things that affect all of its different constituents. So things around protection of content, around managed services, and deals with those issues with policymakers. On the flip side, from a commerce perspective, Arts+Labs brings just different groups together from different parts of the value chain to try to come up with new business models as all of this world and things change. So I can say, speaking as somebody who's been in the media side of things and solely focused on the commerce for most of my career, it's been very interesting to see how things work from the policy perspective. And a lot of times things come up in the policy that, as people in the media business, we say, yeah, you know what, that'll all work itself out. And the reality is there's a lot of work and effort that goes on the policy side, and things that business people should actually be a lot more involved in to make sure that we're in the front end of that conversation versus the back end of the conversation when the policy has all been decided. So if anyone wants to find out more about Arts+Labs, you can come find myself or John Henke, who's here tonight as the executive director. But that's who is sponsoring tonight's event. And with that, I will introduce our moderator, Andrew Keene, renowned author, or author extraordinaire, who wrote The Cult of the Amateur and many more. And I will let him take it from here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. So it's a real honor to be here tonight. And we have a star-studded panel who have sacrificed their stomachs by eating extremely fast to speak on this panel. So I'm going to invite them up, and hopefully they are now well nourished and inspired to be very controversial tonight. Sorry about the rush. So the subject of tonight's panel the subject of today's panel are the opportunities and the challenges of the new digital economy. And I thought what we would do to get things rolling was I asked all the panelists to, in under 5 minutes, lay out what they see the major challenges and opportunities are. Someone said to me beforehand that he thought 5 minutes was too long, so if they want to do it in a minute or two, please be my guest, but I will try and cut you off after 5 minutes. Then we'll have some interactive panel discussion, and then of course we will strongly encourage questions, comments from the floor. So starting with Brian Napier, who is the president of Macmillan, which is one of the big 6 publishers. Brian has some extremely interesting opinions and positions on both the threats and the opportunities to the digital economy. Brian?
Well, I'm going to try to be controversial, so...
If you're going to be controversial, you have to speak into the mic.
I'll do my best.
And by the way, this is being filmed, so it will be forever enshrined on the Arts+Labs site. So you should not only be controversial, but carefully controversial.
Right. Well, I'm Brian Napak, and the president of Macmillan, which is a company that most people know a little bit about, in that many of you had our name on books that you read growing up. And many of you may have known about us in the last few weeks because we were heavily involved in a high-profile quarrel with Amazon. So we know a lot about controversy, and frankly, we are struggling to figure out what the digital economy means. As a book publisher, it's rather a new thing for us to be in the limelight. Suddenly in the last year, we've sort of come out from the dusty shadows. People love books. Books have a very special place in our society and a very special place in most of our lives. But you never really think about the publishers, and you never really think about the authors beyond the book. But in the last few years, with the advent of e-readers, with the advent of digital books, and with the advent of piracy, people are thinking a hell of a lot about books and the threats and opportunities therein. So if asked to speak about the opportunities and threats, one has to start with the threats. There's no question in my mind that there are enormous challenges on the horizon now for the book business. We've had the real pleasure of sitting on the sideline and watching all the rest of you people get challenged by digital media, yet it never affected the book business. And there's pretty good reason, right? A book turns out to be a pretty good way to read a book.
That's a quotable line.
An 8-track tape was never a good way to listen to music. In fact, a CD wasn't actually very good either. So books have continued along, and they were not optimized for the screen. But all of a sudden, we have a generation of devices and a generation of readers willing to use those devices that bring the books into the digital age. So as we move into the digital age, we have to underline the main issue facing our industry, the book publishing industry. When I say book publishing, I want to parenthetically say we are equally in the consumer book publishing business as well as in the education business. And in both of those businesses, we are being thwacked in a huge way by piracy. Piracy is an issue most people know a little bit about now, but my fundamental belief is as IP industries or as creative industries, if we don't come together and create a comprehensive plan and comprehensive actions in order to address piracy, all of our businesses may go away. At the very least, they'll be significantly smaller. And that comprehensive plan needs to have a balance between creating great product, creating it at delivering at a fair price in methods that the consumer wants. So we'll call that creating a fair marketplace. And on the other hand, legislation and enforcement. As the knowledge economy, if we don't protect our intellectual property, I really don't know what we have. What we have is a major jobs issue, because I don't know what we'll all do if we're not trading on intellectual property. So that's the number one threat. The big opportunity for us is also our second big challenge, which is that we have an opportunity as the internet atomizes the content and atomizes our behaviors and people become more and more distracted. We have an opportunity to bring to the market content that the public needs, the public demands. I'll speak about the book business, but I think this applies equally to television, to movies, and to music. When I say bring to market an important product that the consumer wants, that the consumer needs, that the consumer is willing to pay for, it is not clear to me, it is clear to me that there is a role for an edited book, an authoritative book by an author, where a publisher has spent months, years finding the author, nurturing the author, helping the author to bring a book to market. The publisher helps to package that book, edit it, market it, bring it to market in a way that not only gets it known by the widest possible audience, but protects that intellectual property on behalf of not just the publisher, but on behalf of the author. So what we have to do as publishers is we have to focus on what we are really, really good at. There was a time when all that mattered in publishing is that you had a warehouse and a sales force. I buy a book, I put it in my warehouse, I print it, put it in my warehouse, and I take it out to a bookstore. Nobody else could do that. Therefore, I had a reasonable degree of defensibility in my position. Well, it turns out in the digital world, the sales force is less important, the warehouse is unimportant, and the ability to print books almost goes away as a defensible advantage. So we need to be really good at the two things that publishers of all kinds need to be good at. One is editing, meaning finding, editing, packaging content, creating the best possible content for the audience. And the second thing that we need to be very good at is we need to be good at connecting that author through their content to an audience. And so a lot of people are running around with their hair on fire right now, worried about piracy, worried about Amazon, worried about price points. It's never been about price point in the business. The price will be what the price will be. What we have to do is we have to make sure we have a valuable product and we can connect our audience with our authors. If we do that, we have a huge opportunity. If we don't do that, we run the risk of A, commoditization of the content, and B, piracy as our big enemies. So there is a huge opportunity. I'm actually very optimistic about the future of the book business. We do have to get over some hurdles to get there.
6 minutes. Very good.
6?
And I have to admit that my next book's coming out with Macmillan, so I have to be a bit careful what I say to Brian.
We're going to stop that.
So the next commentator is Channing Dawson, and Channing was the guy who told me he can do it in less than 5 minutes. Channing is a legendary guy in the video business, based in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's an advisor to the Scripps Network and a visionary when it comes to building next-generation models for distributing video, both, I think, on the television and on the internet, and perhaps those two things are the same. So, Channing, can you do it in under 5?
Easy. Okay, so there's a couple things facing us. I learned the power of television. I left the publishing industry 15 years ago when I was at the New York Times Magazine Group in the design magazines that they owned, and I had a sense that it was shifting then, and it's just now those waves are lapping on the shores today on the publishing industry on the magazine side. But went to HGTV and launched HGTV in '94, and we did it as a magazine would launch. We launched against a vertical niche, and it became a mega niche. And I never learned the power of television so well as this last year, when we're in the worst housing recession in 80 years, we're in the worst recession in 70 years, and what happened was HGTV cut its expenses and rode the wave out. And this is in a business that is $400 billion a year just in the flywheel of the business that is remodeling and home building. And somehow television rode that through. Our ratings were up, our visits to our websites were up, and there's a certain insight to that we're still trying to figure out. But the business of television was the thing that held us through this, and I think people have now come to depend on it. More viewing of TV it's higher today than it has been in history. Some 8.5 hours or 8 hours and 20 minutes per household per day. So it's an interesting business, but we still face this digital economy that we're facing. 95% of our income at Scripps comes from television, not from the digital side, not from the internet side, though we have two of the largest websites in our genres, in foodnetwork.com and hgtv.com. So when I look at the threats to us, there's several that I find interesting. One is, from a television perspective and a television network perspective, we've never had a one-to-one relationship with the consumer. We've had a relationship to an audience. The cable operators have had the relationship to the consumer. When you talk to a cable operator or you talk to a consumer, they think HGTV is for free. They're paying their bill to the cable guy, but they think HGTV is free. So were we to take our content out on the web, which we do, we have some 20,000 shorts and some 2,000 hours of content out on the web right now of long form. It's free. It's ad-supported, but it's free. So that's a business model that will not be maintained. We can't continue that. But it's what's expected. So we need to learn how to revalue the content that we have that we're putting out. And we also have to, most importantly, understand that we have a one-to-one relationship with consumers that we don't currently have. Secondly, inside our company, I think we've got a huge gap between the group that is doing television and the group that is doing the internet. They're still speaking different languages. I hear it today. There's no crossover language between the two groups. We don't understand each other's thinking. We build programming differently. We have a lot of learning to do in the internal structure. Thirdly, I think the ad models for on-demand are not consistent with growing a viable business. If we're going to make content available for everybody where they want it, when they want it, on any time, we're dealing with on-demand content, and the very structure of on-demand content doesn't lend itself to a viable business model yet. We have no experience at doing subscription. We need to learn that business. So there's lots of issues related to that we'll talk about. Under 5?
Under 5, but not that much under. So next guy is the guy, this is the guy whose job I really want. Rick Cotton is the EVP and the General Counsel at NBC Universal. So he knows as much about how to monetize, or perhaps how not to monetize content, as anyone in the media business today. So Rick, you've got 5 minutes to figure out the future of media.
I guess that's a reference to NBC being in 4th place. I guess I'll start out in terms of opportunity. 11% of the U.S. economy is driven by the creative industries in this country, and that's not a surprise. The U.S. economy is not a low-wage manufacturing economy. It is a knowledge-based economy. It is driven by invention, by innovation, ingenuity, and creativity. And that is obviously where NBC Universal is firmly placed. We're a content creation company, and I think the opportunity in terms of the internet is that it opens up distribution capabilities that obviously have never existed before. It does offer the opportunity to deliver content when, where, and how the consumer wants it, which is obviously what today's consumer is, is demanding. I would certainly agree with the prior comments that the one thing that collectively we have not figured out is what the right business model on the internet that will monetize and enable very expensive content, whether that's news gathering, whether that's sports, or whether that's entertainment, to generate the revenue which justifies that investment. And that is a collective challenge in terms of the distribution opportunities that the internet provides. But the threat is clear, which is the one thing that those new distribution models cannot compete with is free, is stolen. And so the threat of the internet is what obviously is a central topic of tonight, which is the rampant piracy, the tidal wave of digital theft that is currently manifested on the internet. And my own comment about that is really, I'd make 2 points. One is somehow we've wound up with openness and access on the internet somehow embracing lawlessness. And at a time when government policy is to promote the broadband internet, I would just make the observation that cannot be sustained. And so what we're really talking about is trying to find ways to wind up with a rule of law on the internet which respects the values of access, which respects the values of openness, which respects the values of privacy, but which winds up with a real commitment that the notion of that our image of the broadband internet cannot be and should not be Somalia as the way of the future. And so I believe actually that we're making progress. We've seen the fact that digital technology in fact does provide us with the tools to reduce the rampant nature of piracy on the internet. And really the challenge, I think, for all of us and for the society really is the will to employ the tools and the will to move forward, where collectively what we insist on is the rule of law on the internet and the ability to allow the emergence of new business models which are sustainable, which will allow us to continue to consume and have the advantage of serious news gathering, sports, and high quality entertainment, which at the end of the day is what consumers want.
Thank you, Rick. So every panel needs a plumber, and we have one of the best plumbers in the business. Jeff Turner, who is the founder and the CTO of InterStream, which is, I guess, would it be fair to say, Jeff, a next-generation plumbing company, and you're figuring out how to deliver these exciting new models on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think I was invited here primarily because I'm the technical guy. I've been working and involved with the internet for almost 30 years at a variety of companies, including Cisco, Hewlett-Packard, and Novell, prior to founding Interstream. Basically, what we're about is creating a premium quality delivery system that allows a number of ISPs to participate with one another and share in the monetization of the traffic that flows across the network. In terms of what I see as threats and opportunities, and I'll take them in that order, the fundamental threat, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but I'm going to spin this a slightly different way. I think the fundamental threat is what I call the darknet. And the challenge is that the darknet evolved in such a way because the internet grew up without adult supervision. The internet grew up with agencies and groups like ICANN, which created a structure that wasn't there to enforce digital property rights. And if we have that recognition that digital property rights and the rights of the rights holders to track their content as it flows across the internet today is very limited, we can see how, and my best examples of this are what has happened with the music industry. Sites like Listen Forever or all of MP3.com emerged. This took like World Trade Organization action in order to shut down some of these websites. That was never built into the original ICANN model in the domain name system. So what has emerged is this enormous black hole in which all this content gets sucked into and distributed in pirated form over sites like the new ones like Mega Download and RapidShare, which is very big in Europe, where you can easily go off and find these link sites and download this pirated content and consume it at free will without any form of payment whatsoever. And the challenge is that there's also this light net that is emerging. Sites like Hulu, for example, and all the authorized content sites, Apple, iTunes, etc., they are licensing and distributing content and paying the rights holders for use of that content, but they cannot nearly keep up with those other sites, the darknet side of things, in which that content is being distributed in a form that is not paid for and has the equivalent distribution and quality of experience that the darknet has. And in between, there's some place I call the gray net, which, depending upon which side of the fence you may sit on, is the likes of Hulu and such. Or excuse me, I shouldn't have said that. I should have said the likes of YouTube and such. YouTube and those sites, depending upon how you measure it day to day, they have different levels of pirated content that is being distributed across the network, and there really is no, as Rick just said, there's no law, there's no real order in how that might be distributed. So the opportunity, I think, is actually to create a higher quality of experience for consumers and do it in such a way that we can operate the internet under the existing private commercial agreements and infrastructure that's out there today and enable that high quality of experience for the light net as opposed to the dark net or perhaps the gray net. And that's the association that we're forming, is to find the policies and rules around what that gray net is, as well as what the technical standards and business agreements need to exist between the parties that are part of that value chain. And so, I mean, really, I see this as an opportunity for a new media renaissance so that we can distribute a high quality of experience for the end users and enable them to get a true internet TV-like experience for legitimate and authorized content.
Thank you. So I've never been much for titles, but I love that our last but not least speaker is Link Howring, and I'm intrigued by his title. It's VP of Internet and Technology. So Link, could you explain that title?
They're related somehow. After what I've heard, I mean, there certainly were some opportunities mentioned, but I heard a lot of concerns. And my mom, when she was raising me, said that she used to say that I was smiling. Even when I was a baby, I was always smiling. So I'm probably going to be more optimistic than I am pessimistic. I think there actually are quite a few opportunities. Let me start out looking at our industry and just really quickly. Verizon used to be, years and years ago, Bell Atlantic, and before that it was C&T Telephone Company. So we were a telephone company. And I joined the company, I was on the Hill for 10 years, did defense investigative work and CI3 communications, satellite stuff, so that's how I got into communications. And when I joined Bell Atlantic in 1986, I'd say, I don't know how much of the revenue, but probably, certainly a huge majority of our revenue was telephone service. That was it. data was nothing other than there were some high-speed lines for businesses, but not for consumers, certainly. If you go 10 years from there, in 1996, you already started seeing a shift in our business, and today, the voice part of our business is a relatively small portion of what we do. Broadband or data services are a huge part of it. We're now in the television business, which we never could have done before because our networks never would have allowed it. And we're a really major supplier of wireless services, which is a total change from where we were. I joined the company in 1986, and in 1991 I went into what was then called Bell Atlantic Mobile Systems, one of the first mobile companies, and people laughed at us in the company because wireless, are you kidding me? It's never going to be huge. And in fact, there was a projection by Touche Ross at the time I joined the company that by 2000 there would be 1 million wireless customers. There are 275 million wireless accounts in the United States today, and globally, about 4.5 billion people have some kind of wireless phone or some connection, either an internet connection or a wireless connection. It's just astounding when you think about it. In a few years, it probably won't be too many years, we'll actually have most of the people in the globe can be connected in some way. That's astounding when you think about it. So to me, in terms of opportunities, having all these people able to communicate and able to be on the internet and actually able to exchange information and communicate back and forth is a huge opportunity and also great for society overall. Now there's some downsides, and I'll talk about those in a second. So to me, that's one of the major advantages. I think mobile especially is important because it never was a screen before, when you think about it, that could do video. A few years ago we began to do TV on our mobile phones, and today smartphones are about 16% of our market is smartphones. Those aren't just smarter phones, they're computers. They're really capable devices, and you know some of the names. iPhone, the Droid that we're selling with Google, by the way, which is a business model you never would have seen a few years ago, and look at that. I mean, that's a whole different change in the industry. So to me, that's one opportunity, a whole set of new screens that never were there before that can do video. We're beginning to deploy something now called LTE, which is actually 4th generation wireless. It can do speeds that rival, or actually 3 or 4 times DSL speeds, so maybe 12, 15 megs down on a wireless network. We don't know yet because we're still doing trials, but a huge capacity. So to me, that's one big opportunity, is the mobile platform. A second one is the environment. It's actually been surprising to me, but over the last 10 years, there's been less, I think, in many ways, regulation, at least traditional regulation of our industry, which has encouraged a lot of growth in the industry, an explosion of investment. The combined wireless and cable and telephone companies every year invest about $65 billion in networks. When you think about the way this economy has been, that's continued for the last several years despite the economy. In fact, next year, or this year, we're projecting we're going to be flat. So even though it sounds like flat in capital spending, it's still $17.5 billion, or around that, $17 billion of investment. And a lot of that is in these new wireless networks and in something we call FiOS, which is our fiber to the home network. We just did a trial, a test. I shouldn't say a trial, our CTO hates me when I say a trial. A test. Can we deliver a gig to the home? A gig is so much capacity, you can't even imagine it. It used to be in the long distance networks, a gig was unheard of. We were able to deliver more than a gig to a home, and in one home, 10 gigs actually. I mean, think about the capacity that that can do and the kinds of things, 3D, and the kinds of things we're seeing today in the theaters, you can do at home.
Can you do that test in Knoxville, Tennessee?
So that's another area, I think, is the capacity in the networks. And the final one is the ability to individualize or really customize a lot of the content and a lot of the services that we provide consumers. It's much greater than it ever used to be. And there's some downsides to that. Again, I'll really quickly talk about those. But the ability to be able to address the consumer in an individualized way, in a lot more granular way than ever before. And in terms of, for example, location types of technologies, that today you can actually address the consumer when they're walking down the street with an ad, potentially. Obviously, there's some issues there, but the potential to be able to get to the consumer the way they want to be addressed is so much better now. And it's not just the networks, it's also the server technology, it's the computers, it's the capability of the devices themselves. Now, so I've been smiling for a minute. So let me just a couple of the threats. And certainly, I recognize the intellectual property issues are significant ones. And certainly, we're a TV provider now. We provide video services. So we certainly recognize it's a major area of concern. And actually, when we get into discussion, we can talk about some of the ways we've been working on that issue. But I do agree with Rick that even though openness, I think, is a fundamental strength of the internet, and it really has been one of the reasons it's grown so much, there is a need to recognize there is a need for rule of law. And there actually are a lot of laws on the internet today. It's not an unregulated space, and in some ways, in some areas, it shouldn't be. For example, child pornography, we have a lot of those kinds of issues we have to deal with all the time. Cybersecurity is an area we're doing a lot of work on, and certainly there are laws in that area. And so there are laws that do apply to the internet and should apply. And I think one of the issues we've got to get straight as a country is what does it mean when you say the internet's an open space? And it doesn't mean that everything can be done on the internet without any repercussions. It does mean there's some things you have to be careful of, and there are legal ramifications if you do certain things, just like there is in the physical space. So one final thing is that I think one of the biggest challenges, aside from cybersecurity and intellectual property issues, is privacy. I think that is a big issue in a lot of ways, and part of the reason it's a big issue is that the anonymity of the internet has made it a really huge and positive force for being able to discourse and talk, but it also allows people to hide behind things and actually do things that are damaging to people. So privacy, protecting people's information, making sure they're not surprised when things are done with their information in ways they weren't expecting. We've got to work on that as an industry, especially since advertising is the biggest way, when you think about it, we support a lot of what's on the internet. And right now there's a real concern in Congress and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, about what's called behavioral advertising, targeted advertising based on what the consumer is doing in the internet. There's a lot of reasons that's really good, because when the consumer is going in various places and you can actually target an ad to them that really is relevant to their needs, a lot of times it's a valuable thing, but it can also create a lot of concerns. But those issues of behavioral advertising and how we advertise effectively and work on the privacy issues is a big area, I think, of a concern that we need to tackle going forward.
So we're going to, I want to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open up the discussion to the floor. The most memorable, I think, thing said this evening was by Rick Cotton, who said, I'm not sure if this is fair, he said, we're not Somalia, right?
I said that cannot be the model for the broadband internet going forward.
Okay, so as I'm sure we all know, Somalia is a lawless society. So what I want to talk about, you all touched on the issue of intellectual property. All of you suggested one way or the other that it's a fundamental threat to your business. So very, very briefly, tell me, if the internet is not to be Somalia, what's the solution? Is it through technology? Is it through culture? Is it through education? Is it through policing? Again, keep it to 30 seconds, please. So, Link, let me start with you.
Well, I think it's a combination of education in part, and certainly it starts in colleges, and some of that's already happening at colleges today. But it's also, I think, commercial businesses working together to try to figure out how to do this in a way that makes sense for all the businesses. So we actually have been doing some work with the RIA, the MPAA, a lot of the content players, on how we can actually create solutions to this problem. And one of the ideas we've been using that has been fairly effective, I think, is what's called notice and pass-through. When a consumer actually apparently is doing something illegal online in terms of downloading material that's not copyright protected, the content owner can actually send a notice to them through us. Now, we don't have any involvement in other than send a notice, but it does warn them that somebody believes you're doing something illegal and you should think about what you're doing. And I think that's fairly effective. Again, it's still early days for that, but that's one approach that we're using.
Jack?
Yeah, the way I look at it is that this is a combination of policy, economics, and technology. The internet is a network of networks, and as such, it has no single jurisdiction. You have no ability to pass a law that will work uniformly across the entire internet. However, there is a set of business agreements that exists across all ISPs in the internet, and by their very nature and the way that they interconnect, you can have influence over the policies and the economics and the technical standards that exist as part of those business agreements. So you can, in effect, create global jurisdiction through just ordinary commercial agreements that work worldwide. And I think that's the real key, is to create a very light form of policing, if you will, and keep the ISPs out of the job of being the policemen, and create a network infrastructure that has the individuals policing themselves when they go to use premium services or the premium network.
Rick?
I think it has two broad pieces. One is there have to be clear opportunities for consumers to get the content they want on legitimate basis. But the second part of it then, assuming that, and assuming that we can find the business models to sustain it, there have to be, in terms of education, heavily in terms of technology, heavily in terms of enforcement, there have to be cues to the internet user that accessing content on an illegal and unauthorized and pirated basis is not acceptable. And I believe that if we marry those two, the problem has been we have sent no cues. The message to the young in particular is no consequences if you access pirated content. And I'll give you just one quick example, which is that the video sharing sites, including YouTube in this country, have adopted over the last 2 years content recognition technology that prevents the easy upload of content from companies who have loaded their digital fingerprints, whether that's music, movies, or other content into the database. And the consequence of that is, from our point of view, very little NBCU pirated content on YouTube and huge traffic to Hulu, where the broadcast content is available on an ad-supported basis. So I think that model, which is legitimate access but very strong technological cues, where I think the ISPs have a huge role to play. I think video sites, from video sharing sites to rapid share to other sites, have to come to the table and be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rick. I have four kids between the age of 19 and 25, and I remember the time when I could no longer talk about sex but had to talk about media ethics. It was one of those things, you know, son, are you going to get off of ninjavideo.net, or am I going to have to force you off it? So I believe in what Rick was saying is legitimize the business models for pushing content to Hulu's and syndicate it around the web and tighten down and in fact anticipate. I mean, what's interesting about the ninjavideo.net model is it's all based on the reputation economy. The better they are at it, the better, the higher they rise in their circle with peer-to-peer. And I think we have to actually disintermediate that if we can in some way. I don't know how to do that, but I truly believe in another model, which is to find a legitimate, good, attractive, appealing business model for putting internet or video on the internet.
Yeah, there's no question that the number one thing we have to do is to create a marketplace, as I said earlier, where consumers can get very high quality content where they want, when they want, fair prices, if it's not paid, and with business models that support it. There's no question that that's number one, but there's a gaping hole in the conversation, which Rick alluded to. It's all well and good to say that if an ISP sends a notice to a consumer that that's part of an education process. But without consequence, it actually doesn't mean anything. So one can be very unpopular as a media executive for saying that we need better legislation. But the fact of the matter is, our government is asleep at the wheel on this issue. If we are the knowledge economy, we have to do more than we've done to date. The current copyright law basically says that a rapid share must take something down when I notify them, I being the copyright owner, that copyrighted material is being trafficked on their site. Well, that sounds good, except all of a sudden I'm the policeman, and I have to go back over and over and over again, and as soon as that content, as soon as another person puts that content again up there, my entire backlist is in jeopardy. We must get to a stage where we don't criminalize pirating. It's not about putting kids in jail, but it is about children and grown-ups recognizing that there's some behaviors that's actually not in the interests of our society, and therefore we are putting a price tag on it. Very unpopular thing to say in a broad setting, but the fact of the matter is, until we do that, we will not succeed. We won a lawsuit in Germany about 3 weeks ago against RapidShare. 5 educational publishers sued RapidShare and won an injunction that forces RapidShare now to support the protection of our intellectual property repeatedly. So now that we've told them the IP is being pirated, they have to protect it or be subject to serious fines. Notice what I said. We won a lawsuit in Germany. Germany happens to have very good laws. When I travel around the world, people ask me, okay, you want us to put in good IP laws in Hong Kong? What are you guys doing? And the answer is, not very much.
So Brian, what would you like to happen? Does Link have to be the policeman here?
link absolutely has to be part of the solution. I'm not really focused. I think the ISPs have an important role to play. I think what's more important is not a person that's downloading content. It's more the commercial traffickers of content, the rapid shares, the 4shares, the guys who are actually making a big profit based upon the facilitation of the theft of content.
One of the challenges, and this is a good discussion, one of the challenges is that a reference was made to notice and takedown, and that's true. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act says that if there's copyrighted material that's being pirated, it's on our sites, we have to take it down. But we don't have that. What's happening today is people are using our service, and they're accessing other sites that we have no control of, and they're global to access this content. So it's a bigger challenge than it was when the DMCA was passed in 1998. And it's an illustration of the problem that we face with legislation, frankly, is that you can create a law, but because technology moves on, it's really hard to figure out how the future is going to unfold. And we thought we had it right, and that piece of the DMCA has been tough because we don't have that kind of problem. We don't have content on our site. It's really on other people's sites that we don't control.
So who's the cop? Who becomes the cop in that?
Well,
what's the hammer?
I do think, and we haven't got the data yet, but I do think the notice and I disagree. I think the notice and pass-through is, in fact, there just was a really interesting case in CNET, which is a communications online magazine kind of thing, and they cover technology. They had an email from a guy who he said, I got a notice, I'm going to go legit. That was his comment. And he had gotten a notice that was a notice and pass-through. It passed from one of the ISPs to him saying, it looks like you're doing something with material that's not yours, it's illegal, please stop, basically. And he said, I'm going to go legit. Now, I'm not saying everybody does that. There are certainly pirate sites, and those guys are never going to be stopped by something like that. But a lot of the traffic that is college kids and those kinds of things who are doing it incidentally and doing it for their own enjoyment and not for commercial purposes or other reasons, I think this can be helpful. I don't disagree that enforcement's a piece of it. There's no question about it. But I do think notice and pass-through is a good beginning tool to start with that approach.
Could I just put a framework around that? The question of who's the cop, I would say, is one question. But we're in a society today, whether you're talking about counterfeit physical product or digitally stolen product, where the infrastructure industries, the intermediaries, the capillaries of commerce, what enables pirated content to get to the consumer, what enables counterfeit physical goods to get to the consumer, have to step up. And it's not really being about a cop, although you could think about it that way. The same way a mall provides security in terms of people not walking out with physical product. What I would say in today's society over the last 20 years as transportation has improved, as communication has improved, is the same way that we imposed obligation on banks not to accept cash from what turned out to be terrorists or drug runners. We're in the process of saying to infrastructure companies like ISPs, like video sharing sites, it's not about the fact that you are the source of the stolen content, but you do have a responsibility to not allow your infrastructure to be hijacked for the benefit of pirates or counterfeiters. And to the extent that our entire economy rests on our ability to realize the economic fruits of our innovation and our IP, I think we will gradually come, and I actually think that the infrastructure industries will step up to the fact that they really do have to be part of the solution. And I give YouTube credit, I give the video sharing sites credit. They're not the source of the pirated content, but they have now put in technology that prevents, at least on a wholesale basis, it'll never be 100%, the easy use of their facilities to allow consumers to access it. I think the ISPs will ultimately step up in the way in terms of sending notices and ultimately imposing sanctions on repeat infringers. I think that the auction sites like eBay will step up. They've begun the process, but they will become more effective in ensuring that their auction sites are not used to auction off either stolen or counterfeit product. But I think this is an evolution, and I think the answer to the question of who's the cop is you need the enforcement against the sites themselves and against the bad actors. But what we most urgently need is these infrastructure, intermediary, distribution parts of our economy to step up and take strong action to prevent their very legitimate distribution capabilities from being hijacked.
So enough threats. Let's talk about opportunities, or perhaps opportunities. Again, I don't mean to pick on you, Rick, but you said we still haven't figured, again, is this fair? You said we still haven't figured out the right business model. Now, I was in this business from the mid-90s. I mean, how many business models are there? So if that's the case, is it possible that there isn't a business model, or what are each of your positions on this? Have we indeed figured out a viable long-term business model for building successful media companies in the digital age?
Yeah, well, it's actually a very easy question for us to answer. The book publishing industry, through no strategic stroke of genius, there were no off-site meetings of the industry intending to do this, but we didn't do something that most of the rest of the media businesses did, which is we never gave our content away for free. It was never the idea that we were going to give away a book and then you would buy another one of the same book. And therefore, people are used to paying for books. And so Amazon has done us an enormous favor in the last 2-3 years. Honest and truly have done us an enormous favor. What they have done is they took to market a vertically integrated platform that took to our best readers, a digital platform that allowed people to pay a fair price for a book. We can argue whether the price of a new hardcover, the equivalent of a hardcover book, should be $9.99 or $12.99, which is basically what it's down to now. But everyone expects to pay for a book. As we move through our value chain and look at the education side of our business, on the education side of our business, a textbook was never a very good way to consume information. A textbook actually is just a tool, and over the years, textbooks migrated out of the educational process to the point where a lot of kids didn't even buy them because they didn't have to. Well, now what the innovative publishers have done is they've integrated homework, assessment, additional media, community, the ability to assign and grade things right into the product. And so now we have a business model on the education side where piracy is actually a massive and present threat, and we as a company are losing tens of millions of dollars a year on our sales because of PDF versions of our books on RapidShare. Any one of my textbooks you can find on RapidShare for free in PDF fashion. That's bad news in the short run, but in the long run we know that education is about participation and interactivity, so we have a value proposition that if we do our jobs right, can sustain us.
So Channing, has the video business, the online video business, found a viable business model?
Not in the on-demand space, but the emergence of TV everywhere as a model to somewhat protect and extend the cable model.
Do you want to explain for people?
TV everywhere is the ability to authenticate and authorize subscribers to cable networks access to that same content from television, move it over to the internet. So last night's primetime could show up on your PC tomorrow or on your Mac tomorrow if you go to Comcast.net or Xfinity and say, I am Joe Blow and this is my PIN number, and they authenticate you and then authorize you to the service that you have in fact paid for. So now they're just moving it to a new platform. What that does is preserve the cable model, the subscription model. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem of the networks becoming something that has value per se, but the subscription still has value and the model of the cable infrastructure is maintained. We actually like that as a cable network because it retains a position for us to have a revenue stream from the cable operators as well as an ad model. My problem with the future business models, we haven't figured out the ad model. We haven't figured out that there's not enough inventory in the on-demand world to equal that which is television. Television is an amazing stream of content on a 24/7 basis. On-demand is not. It's one-tenth of the amount of inventory. So I think there's a problem with that. But preserving the subscriber model is actually a pretty good step forward.
Rick, would you agree with that? I mean, you're in the middle of this. Obviously, Hulu's a fascinating case study. People imagined in the beginning that advertising would drive free video networks like Hulu. Is that really not the future?
Well, I think you have to start out with the proposition and it needs to, on a widespread basis, be internalized that if we want to sustain expensive news gathering, if what consumers want are, an example that NBCU just went through, the Olympics, where the cost to NBC was in the vicinity of $1 billion for 16 days of competition. If consumers want highly expensive film or TV product, if that's what they want, no one is forcing anyone to consume any of this. It's a question of whether socially that's the content that people want. Then there has to be some way to generate revenue to justify the investment. I would actually say that local news gathering is among the most threatened species of expensive content. You see newspapers struggling enormously. You see local broadcast stations struggling enormously. So in the current environment where the internet absolutely has fractured audiences, fractured old business plans, the question is what is going to emerge in terms of the way consumers can find it appealing to consume that very expensive content and yet have it generate revenue to support the activity that consumers appear to want. And so right now, I would say no, we don't quite see what is going to be attractive to consumers on the internet in a way that generates the kind of revenue if the audience is going to move dramatically from old ways of consuming content to new ways. There are three alternatives, at least by my count, is it can be ad-supported. People can pay by the drink. iTunes is a very good example, both in terms of music and video, or you can wind up with subscription models or some combination of those three. But right now, I mean, my CEO of NBC Universal is famous for having quoted, for his quote that right now at least in the video space is happening is that companies are trading analog dollars for digital pennies. So the experimentation will continue. It will be trial and error. But right now, no one has mastered the question of what is both appealing to consumers and generates sufficient revenue to justify the investment of what the consumers want.
There's one thing about that that's interesting, which is, there's lots of things that are interesting, but the idea of data being more important, the end use of data, and the personalization of the datafication of the end user, so that you can increase the value of the advertising. There's some producers of content here who are getting in the realm of $2,000 CPMs for highly targeted content. So if we can get to that model, there may well be an ad model, but it's so rare. And the irony is that it depends on data that we can't get access to in many cases. So that's one of the problems, is the privacy laws will run into the data, into the business models. And I think that's where some of the most interesting stuff is.
So Jeff, Rick has been very honest here, and it's depressing. I mean, he's talking about dollars being translated into dimes. You're the plumber. How do you help these guys build more viable business models?
Well, I think the answer has probably already been stated. There's your CPMs, your cost per mil, cost per thousand impressions. There's the affiliate fees that are generated back to the publishers, that is the distributors of the content over the cable channels and satellite channels and such, and telco TV channels. And then you also have to be able to demonstrate that you have much more and better information for each of the individual subscribers. The TV Everywhere model is perhaps one of the directions that can take. I think the business models already exist to solve the problem. The large question is, do we have the high quality distribution that's going to actually allow us to distribute all of the content over the internet as opposed to those traditional distribution mechanisms? And once you can build interactivity into that model and you can change the value chain so that the publishers of the content can get direct access to that information, then you can also get those CPMs up. Or I think the ultimate vision is to go to a CPC type model, which Google has made so famous, where you're getting a much higher value per transaction, per advertisement, and eliminating the DVR users in addition, because they can't skip past the commercials.
So Ling, You're probably the most cheerful on this panel, aren't you? I mean, people are still going to buy your phones. They're still going to need to use the ISPs. Are you as pessimistic as everybody else?
Well, the truth is, the technologies that we're using in this environment have all become digital, and they become fast-changing. And there's a really interesting Harvard Business Journal article a few weeks ago that looked at change in our industry. And basically what they said was, if you look back at past technologies, there were platforms like when we electrified the country or when we went to steam engines, you had a period where there's a rapid change and adaptation to the technology, and then it kind of stabilized. And you could develop business models, and you had a fairly steady time where you could actually adapt your business to it. That's never going to be the same anymore. And the reason is the technology just continues to improve so dramatically, and it democratizes everything. So now you have people who have little devices in their hands that are as powerful as things that I was using 20 years ago to do digital morography in my office. I was doing all kinds of things digitally in my office, but with a silicon graphics machine that cost $200,000. Now you can do it on a little device. So as a result, you've got people that can create content at the end, and they're not commercial. They're average citizens. So I think that means the business models are not going to be stable. And I think what it means for us as companies is it makes it more imperative that we figure out how to work together and collaborate on different kinds of business opportunities. And that's one of the reasons I'm very concerned about some of the rules that the FCC's, the Federal Communications Commission, is proposing. They're proposing what's called net neutrality rules, and on the surface, net neutrality sounds great, a neutral network. But what it really means is companies can't manage their networks. If you take your wireless phone, it has to be managed. Our networks have to be managed. Your cell phone is sending signals literally thousands of times a minute to the cell tower to say, how much power do I need? I'm behind a building, change the way the signal is done. That's all network management. And the way the rules are drafted, it's very hard to understand how we could do that effectively if those rules are put in place. So one of the concerns I do have, to be on the negative side a little bit, is that you can have government regulations that actually make it difficult to adapt business models and work together collaboratively. And I think that's really the key to our industry, is finding ways we can continue to work together on new business models and new approaches.
So I'm going to open this up to the audience, but finally, I'm interested in your opinions on net neutrality.
Well, can I just say, I'm not a pessimist. I'm actually an optimist. I mean, I believe that the issues that we've been talking about will get resolved. I mean, there's a certain element that an economist was once famously quoted as saying that things that are impossible to continue generally don't. And I don't think that the current pattern of the internet can continue in terms of a lawless fashion. So what it's always hard to remember is we're really at the very beginning of the broadband internet. I mean, it is in its absolute infancy. And so it would be, if you went back 150 years in this country's history and said, well, the Wild West, Jesse James is out there and it's lawless and it'll just never, ever, ever be civilized, and one will never be able to have to live without fear of being robbed at any moment. That's, I think, where we are with the internet, which is that it is going to change dramatically, and it will evolve as the government supports it, promotes it, as it becomes a pillar of 21st century society, and by trial and error, new business models will be identified. Consumers will learn to consume legitimate content, and it's really a question of exactly how we'll get there. And I think it takes it'll take a lot of work to do it. But I think you can only be optimistic precisely because of the power of the technology. It offers so much in terms of potential distribution, potential access by consumers, that I think it'd be hard not to be optimistic.
In complete agreement. I mean, we have focused on a couple of negative topics. I view that there is a high likelihood we will resolve many or most of these in the years to come. But we're seeing enormous benefit across our businesses by the monetization of content through new channels, new platforms. We have Apple coming into the market with a spectacular new device, which is going to enable not just books, but magazines and newspapers to be read better, and Apple is dedicated to a commercial model. When a player like that comes into the market, it will not only legitimize the consumption of content in certain ways, but they're just going to be better at it. They're going to be better at it than some cheap device where you have to go to a file sharing site, you never know what you're going to get, and you may get you're likely to get a virus on your machine while you're downloading it. So so I'm very optimistic about that, and I'm also optimistic to get back to something Rick said earlier. A lot of the players in the business that traffic in our content, are trying hard to turn legitimate. So there's a site called Scribd, and I've been a big detractor from Scribd. Scribd is one of the largest places where people have gone to acquire free content. But Scribd is now instituting filtering that actually works pretty well. And people are going there now, and they're not finding our content. And now Scribd, now that they're policing, we're giving them our content to sell for free. So there are big, legitimate enterprises which are working in the interest, in our shared interest, as you said earlier, Rick, of a business model that works for all of us, whether it be the infrastructure player, the retailer, or the content provider. So I'm highly optimistic. Otherwise, I'd have to crawl under the table.
There's one other thing about digital that it's very appealing. We're in touch with our customers much more than we have been in a one-way system when we're sending content down and there's no back channel. So all of the touch points that they're using to be in touch with us, either on the internet or on mobile or on television, interactive television, or in any way, it now becomes a conversation, which is vastly better idea of communities or customer service than what we've done before. So in that sense, it's a huge deal.
So conversation time, right? You've had enough, you guys. Let's have some questions from the floor. This lady, I think John, do we have a mic, please? And if you can announce yourself and your affiliation. I'm not keen on anonymity.
Janine Small, Carol Guido-Groffman. Sorry, I'm a little hoarse, as you can tell. I don't know if this is a question or more of a comment, but just one thing, the problem with the enforcement now is that people don't really have the incentive to be legitimate, because when you start legitimate, by the time you're done licensing, you're out of money, and it's the people that are illegitimate that get in trouble, the YouTubes and all the other companies, that after getting in trouble legitimize, and so it's almost an incentive to be illegitimate. And so it seems like that's a big issue, is the enforcement and how to get that from the beginning, and also how do we get on the intellectual property side. And I know it's very difficult to get the publishers and the record labels and all these different people to simplify the system so that licensing is much easier, and I'm sure you're all many conversations about that, but do we think that there's any hope for trying to get more of a standard?
What's your question?
Well, I guess the first one was just really an issue. I don't think it's a question, the fact that legitimate versus illegitimate. But then the other question is how to ease the licensing process for people that are trying to do legitimate businesses so that they can actually license the property, find who the owners are, and find rates without being stuck for years and years in limbo. So just if anyone's sees any light at the end of that horizon.
Gentlemen, any responses to that?
It strikes me as a marketplace issue, right? That the price will find its right level, so that if we can't sell content for what we feel is a good price, then we're not going to be in business. So eventually, the price for licensing will come down, and it'll be a legitimate process.
It's not the price for licensing; it's the fact that if you don't license, you're infringing, and you're a copyright infringer. So how do you actually legitimately license?
How do you get access to the content?
Look, the fact of the matter is, it's tricky, and it's always been tricky for the little guy. I think we touched on it a little earlier when we talked about the technologies helping things, helping people to access our content, to find the marketplace, to be able to transact for it, is still in its infancy. As is, and perhaps even more important, the ability, once that content is put up someplace else, to not just for that person to monetize it, but then to channel the appropriate revenues back to the various copyright holders. We have tens and thousands of books that are in print that are selling. The idea of that content being out there is scary enough, but being out there with literally no way to track it. So the music industry's done a reasonably good job of this over the years in the traditional world with radio and that sort of thing. In the book business, there was no way to do it, and so as part of the now very famous Google settlement with the book business, Google was going to be setting up, or is going to be setting up, optimistically speaking, a clearinghouse where a rights holder, where someone can find out who the rights holder is, someone can acquire the content, and then ultimately the revenue from that, or the share of that, can be repatriated to the publisher and the author, in our case. But we are in our infancy, and those things are expensive to put in place. They don't exist today, at least not in our parts of the business, and we're a long way from it. We viewed that one of the biggest benefits of the Google settlement was that it was going to establish just such a clearinghouse and just such a marketplace.
So is there, Larry Lessig wrote a book called Remix, in which he implied that there is this huge potential economy of cultural remixes that are being stymied, again, I don't mean to pick on Rick, but by large media. Is that fair? I mean, I think that was really the point of this lady's question.
Well, if I talk about the mashup, the remix, I think that's a legitimate issue, and I think there's quite a willingness on the part of media companies today, recognizing the times have changed, to engage on that. But my problem with that issue, or generally the way it's used, is that it's raised in a way that it is intended to have the conclusion that therefore no action of any kind should be taken against the tidal wave of piracy. And what I would say from the point of view of a large company is the entire focus is not on small pieces of content. It is on entire episodes, it is on entire movies, it is on entire skits of Saturday Night Live, as to which there is no conceivable change that has been added by anyone. It is just simply the uploading of a totally unchanged piece of copyrighted content. I think that's true in music, I think that's true in books. So having said that, the entire effort in terms of whether one is talking about enforcement, whether one is talking about digital tools to prevent dissemination of copyrighted content, is entirely focused on this unchanged wholesale redistribution of entire works. And so the question of how to allow play in the system, and what I would say, at least in terms of our experience, and we've looked at this enormously carefully in terms of YouTube, where this is really a central question. And I would just tell you that is not what people are uploading. I mean, you are down into the tiny single digits of material where there's even any effort to have any kind of remix. It is, and there, in fact, we actually wind up working with YouTube, cut people an enormous amount of slack. But so what I would say is that largely in this discussion, it is a red herring. It is not real. Having said that, to the extent that there are those concerns, we're entirely willing to work and to try to figure out where you allow that play in the system. But it is so totally not what the problem is on the internet that I think that that issue becomes a little frustrating, because it is generally raised only to say don't do anything. If it's raised from the point of view of how do we work together to allow remixes or mashups to have some play in the system, perfectly fair, and I think you'll find every content owner willing to engage in that conversation.
Link, do you agree?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that area, but it's so no, I can't really comment on it.
More questions. Andrew, the back.
Thank you. Andrew Richet from the Personal Democracy Forum and Tech President. I want to first make a quick comment and ask a question. I want to challenge the notion of how dangerous piracy really is, because with the music industry, the main reason why people were using Napster or networks for piracy of music was because it was easier for them to find the music illegally than it was for them to find it legitimately. And the cost was, $15 for a CD made it reasonable for someone to want to look for a single song they were looking for free, then, because they couldn't get that song online easily. And we have a history where, for example, people would put these scramblers on top of set-top boxes, but at some point it got easier for most people to just be able to pay their cable bill and get whatever they wanted, and they stopped looking for these scramblers, and eventually the piracy issue went away because it was easier to get legitimate content than it was to steal it, because most people, I frankly think, aren't thieves. So, but I wanted to offer that as a comment, but The real question I wanted to ask has to do with the fact that almost every single one of you have used the word consumer. And I'd like to challenge that word because the people that you're trying to reach aren't consumers, they're actually partners. I want to offer you one statistic. In the 2008 presidential campaign, there were 1.5 billion views of online videos that mentioned Obama or McCain. Only 150 million of those video views were of videos produced by the candidates or the parties themselves, meaning 9 out of 10 videos watched during the presidential campaign that mentioned Obama or McCain were produced by individuals. Every part of this discussion today has been about the content that you produce or distribute as it's received by the consumer. And the elephant that's in the room, and I'm curious to hear your comments, is the fact that the people who are interacting with your content are actually producing content themselves that may actually trump your content, whether they remix it or not. And until there's a fundamental understanding of how the media ecology has changed, you're going to continue to look for a business model that preserves the old way of thinking rather than the new way of thinking. And I'm curious how you think about that.
Actually, I did talk quite a bit about that. I think I might have been an exception because one of the reasons I mentioned that I said at one point that a lot of the content is created by people with smartphones. And the reason I mentioned that is that the devices now have 5 megapixel, 7 megapixel cameras in them and video capability, so kids can do a lot on their own mobilely, and that's what they're doing. So I agree with you. There's a lot of content produced by individuals that is uploaded. You go to a site like break.com, for example, there's some pirated material there, but a lot of it is just videos they've done, you know, for all kinds of things that are happening around the neighborhood and everything else. They're kind of, most of them are kind of silly, frankly, and some of them are kind of hard to watch, but it is content, and there's a lot of those kinds of sites out there. But that's not really the piracy issue we're talking about here. Most of that content, if you go to those kind of sites, is really just videos that they've done of, you know, like almost home video kind of stuff. They don't present the same kind of issues.
I would add to that I like the word that you used there, ecology. The ecology of the ecosystem has to preserve unanticipated innovation like the internet has today. So you have to create an infrastructure and an ecosystem that allows people to innovate in unforeseen ways and not be too onerous or restrictive. And that, I mean, that's one of the challenges I see when I hear about laws and legislation being passed even within an individual jurisdiction like the US. Onerous laws and restrictions, whether it be on the net neutrality side of things or policing the network side of things, restricts and stifles that innovation, so you do not get that the unanticipated new technologies emerging.
One other point about, and Rick touched on, I think it's important too, in terms of the future of the industry, and I'm like him thinking that a lot of these things are going to get worked out. And one of the reasons they think that is that if you look at the research on behavioral consumer behavior, a lot of what drives consumers is, believe it or not just price but convenience. There really is a strong factor there, and it includes teens too. It includes kids in college, even though some of them, if you look at our industry in terms of the folks who are using the most capacity, there's a small percentage that are using a lot of it, and those are probably the kids that are really the geeky types, the kinds of kids who are doing some of this kind of activity. The ones that aren't, the bulk of the population, are the ones who are going to sites that are easier to use, and they're probably for-pay sites. So a big challenge for us is how do you marry the convenience, the quality, because a lot of times there's much higher quality and there's no viruses and other things in this kind of product, and the pricing. Those kinds of things are the hard things to get right. And over time, I think we will get it, and it will, the market will be able to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is I think there's a huge recognition of that really enormous capability on the part of the internet in terms of social networking, in terms of the participatory opportunities that it presents, and I would say in terms of enterprises that are in the business of presenting material to audiences. There's a fascination with it, and there's an effort to try to understand how to interact with it, how to serve it, how to respond to it. But I think the comment that I would make to you is we're fine as a content owner with all of that activity. We think it should be encouraged. We think that it's wonderful that people engage in it. Our problem, however, is not that people do that. It's that there is vast traffic which is not interested in looking at the material that has been generated by individuals, which we're delighted with for people to look at that. But what they're trafficking in is precisely not that. they're trafficking in stolen movies, they're trafficking in stolen books, they're trafficking in stolen games. So if in fact the people that we were talking about were doing exactly what you suggest, which is engaged in creating their own material, whether it's video, whether it's musical, whether it's combinations, and that was what they were consuming, I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But the activity that we're talking about is when people are not doing that, but rather what they want is very expensive, whether it's news, sports, or entertainment, and they're taking it and stealing it.
But Rick, Andrew's question is that the very nature of media has changed. Would you accept that?
Well, what I would say is that there are many elements of the media landscape that are changing enormously. I mean, audiences are fracturing, the capability of people to produce their own media is clearly changing, the ability to social network is clearly changing. The need, in fact, I mean, clearly the audience is going to more and more gravitate to more and more niche ways, and that's a challenge for anyone who has been in the professional content generation business. So there's no question that's all changing. But the point that I'm making is that to the extent that we're talking about expensive news produced by commercial organizations, or we're talking about expensive movies, or expensive sports, or expensive music, there's no obligation on the point of anybody to consume that.
One more question, and then Brian, I want Brian's opinion. But is it possible to combine your view and Andrew's view? Can you have high quality, relatively affordable, interactive content?
Well, of course it is. Of course it is.
Absolutely. Look, there is a pile of user-generated content out there. Some of it's quite amusing. There always has been. In the book business, I get 2 or 3 user-generated books sent to me every week. And I read those books. And very, very occasionally, one of those books makes it into the editorial process and gets delivered to the consumer as a published book. That consumer, that generator of that content is aspirational. They put a lot of hard work into it. And now more than ever, there's a way for that user to get that content to the market. It's called Lulu, or it's called Author House. There is no obstacle whatsoever to being a published author right now. But to hark back to what Rick said, that is not what people are buying. It is not what people are downloading for free. The hundreds of millions of books that are sold and read in this country every year tend to be produced by a value-added participant called a publisher. So I also do agree that the vast majority of people are not pirates. The vast majority of people, if there is a good place to find content, to buy it, to consume it at a fair price, will do that. There are probably a percentage, we'll call it 20%, who are thieves. I don't want that percent to grow, which is why we talk about a lot of this enforcement stuff. But to get to your final point, which is a very, very profound and important point, which is the partnership with the what I call a consumer or a reader, what you call a partner. We want to innovate. We want to put our content in the hands of the end user. We're looking for ways to do that, and we just launched a business in a bit of boosterism because I think it helps the conversation. 2 weeks ago, we launched a business called Dynamic Books. Dynamic Books is a textbook company, and we'll publish our own textbooks or anybody else's textbooks through it. And this textbook company takes textbook content that takes, by the way, 8 years or so for an author to write a good textbook. It's a big, labor-intensive process. And it takes that content, puts it in a state-of-the-art ebook platform, sends it out to professors, and allows the professor to change it in any way they want. They can add things, they can delete things. Hopefully this won't happen, but they could turn a biology textbook into an evolution textbook if they wanted to. That is a radical risk for us on so many levels, because we're taking our investment and we're putting it in the hands of the professor. But the reason that we can do that is the education market allows us to monetize that content. It provides us with a way to do that. Happily, our contracts allow us to do it with the content because many authors are quite scared of it. But when we explain to the author that the option is putting your content into this platform, which will allow it to become part of an instructor's process of teaching, and therefore they will never get rid of that book. It will become theirs forever, versus a PDF on RapidShare, where maybe a really well-intentioned person who does not want to be a thief is downloading it. I don't care, it's a lost sale to me. That's innovation, and it's innovation that is partnering with our end user. In the consumer market, it's actually quite harder to see how that happens with books, because nobody really wants to edit Tom Friedman's latest book. They just want to read it, and they want to move on to the next piece of content.
Final question, I think.
Hi. My name is Gary Donatelli. I'm a fourth National Vice President of the Directors Guild of America, and we have a very vested interest in this discussion. To your point in the back, within this last year, in the last couple of years, the Directors Guild has been dealing with new media. We cut a template for contracts in this area, and we've been dealing with different ways to help independent filmmakers still make an independent film. One of our very clever innovators shot a film, a very low-budget film, and put it on the internet, and got hits, got interest, and they proceeded to fund their film a kind of backwards, where they looked on the map and saw where the largest majority of hits were, what towns the film was popular in, and literally went and rented a theater and went to that town and ran their film. And through this process, went across the United States and paid back their investors and made a profit on the film. So there's other than James Cameron trying to talk someone into $500 million for a film, there's someone that's that is taking it the other way and trying to make it work. At the same time, when you talk someone into $500 million or $5 million or $50,000 out of their inheritance to make a picture, if they don't get their return on that picture, we don't make another picture. I know that's real basic, but it's something that's getting hard to get people to understand. I have a request. It is really kind of a question. From our area, we've talked about this a lot. And part of this is our problem and our fault. We've made, piracy really sexy. Johnny Depp, how hot is that? All right? Keith Richards, Errol Flynn, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., need I get older or say more? All right? Piracy is really sexy. We'd like you to call it internet theft, okay? It's theft. When we get a group like this together, we'd like to put that message out there to you. Would you please call it internet theft and forget about the pirates, okay? If it's our fault, we'll grant you, but that's my request.
Your question to the panel, the final question. What's your question to the panel?
My question is, would you please
Yes. We'll call it
go
theft.
forth from here and call it internet theft and not internet piracy?
But do you, finally, it's a fair point. How do you guys respond to Andrew's point that most people on the internet weren't really stealing, they were just taking stuff because they couldn't really legitimately buy? It was too
best food network, food-related website. So we greatly believe in participatory content.
Well, I guess I'd respond just with a very short anecdote, which has to do with the fact that YouTube was really launched by a Saturday Night Live video clip called Lazy Sunday. It was the first viral video on YouTube. This was 4 years ago, a few months after YouTube was launched. It was obviously entirely pirated at that point. Fast forward, YouTube is sold to Google for $1.65 billion. None of the companies who had pirated content on it shared one dime in that. But if now you come to the 2008 election campaign, NBC and Fox had gotten together and created Hulu. Tina Fey did skits involving Sarah Palin, which became enormously popular. Each one of them was viewed on the internet north of 10 million times, and there were multiple skits. But those 10 million views were overwhelmingly to Hulu.com and to NBC.com, because in the same time frame that Hulu had come online, YouTube, as I mentioned before, had adopted content recognition technology, which made it hard inconvenient for internet users to find those clips in their entirety on YouTube. So what happened was literally tens of millions of internet users, partners, whatever you want to call them, moved from YouTube to Hulu.com and to NBC.com. There were no riots in the streets that I noticed. And the point of that is simply to say that the combination of making the content available in a high quality, easily findable way, but at the same time making it difficult or inconvenient to find on a pirated basis can in fact change people's behavior in a very, very short period of time. And I might, apropos of the participatory interest, note that Hulu and NBC.com allow people to embed clips, to take clip materials, put them in emails, and so there is an effort to involve the participatory aspect of the internet. But the main point is that if you combine the cues, you make it available easily, but you make it inconvenient to find it on a pirated basis, the internet user community is very sophisticated and will respond.
Very brief, Andrew, because we've got to finish.
I very much appreciate your answers. I just might repeat the question for the microphone, but the one quick point I want to make is that you're talking about participation with your content, but you don't realize that they are actually participating with each other around your content.
Sure, Facebook.
Your businesses and your business models would improve greatly if you started introducing the participants in your content to each other and let them do what they do, because they will view you as a link and a connector rather than simply a seller of content.
20% of their traffic at hgtv.com comes from viewers who put their own homes onto the site and share amongst themselves. We're very much involved in participatory content, using their content to share amongst themselves.
And final comments, Jeff, and then appropriately, Link, you can comment on Andrew's comment on links.
The only thing I was going to add to Rick's comments is I think the other thing that has to be considered here is the studio release window strategy. I mean, the example I constantly hear, because I tend to hang out with a lot of very geeky types, is that you've got things like Battlestar Galactica, which is a wonderfully produced show that doesn't show up in places like Singapore for 2 years. And unless the studios rectify their international distribution strategies, I think you're going to find that those sites, those individuals, those partner consumers are going to continue downloading and pirating or stealing the content because they can't get access to it in a legitimate fashion. So my big question is, when does Hulu go international?
Link, final comment.
David Halberstam has a really interesting book about the auto industry. It's really worth a read, and there's a section in there that talks about the early days of small cars coming in the United States, and particularly Japanese cars. And there was a truck, I think it was Nissan was selling in 1968, the first small truck in the U.S., and it was really selling like hotcakes, and people began to use it. In the old days, pickup trucks were only for pickup, for basically work. You didn't use them to commute. People started to use it for commuting. And the American manager for Nissan went to the Japanese leadership and said, hey, these guys are using it for commuting. Can we make it a more comfortable vehicle so they can actually use it for commuting as well as using it for work? And the response was, they shouldn't be using it for commuting. It is only a truck. And I think that point I'm trying to make is that what we're really saying, and to your point about consumers and Facebook and how they use social networking, we really know that. I mean, the Droid, for example, we spent a heck of a lot of time on Facebook and in social networking. That's how we sold it. It wasn't advertising. So we haven't got it yet, partly because it changes so much. But I really do believe it's not just a truism. Consumers are in control a lot more than they ever were before. And figuring out what they really want when the technology and figuring out how to meet that need is critical, and it changes. So one quick example is I just bought a DVD the other day that actually lets you copy it onto your computer. You can actually use it, in other words, in more than one place. And there's clearly those kinds of things that consumers want. If you can do it in a controlled way and meet their needs, but still protect your copyright and other interests, I think we can do a lot better job in the marketplace. And we've got to do a better job of it. That's all there is to it.
I want to thank, I think this has been a great panel, and I really want to thank these guys for going for an hour and a half and maintaining their coherence. And even dealing politely with Andrew Rousset, I think it was quite an achievement. So thank you.